Welcome to the Lessons from Leaders podcast. I'm your host, Brian Beckcom. In this episode, I speak with Robert Ingalls. Mr. Ingalls is a former practicing lawyer, professional speaker, and the founder of a company called LawPods, a company that's specifically designed to help busy professionals start and market their own podcast. In this episode, Robert and I talk about how to start your own podcast, answering the why of your specific podcast, how to come up with a good name, the type of equipment and software he recommends, how to market and spread your podcast, make it stand out from the rest, from the thousands and thousands of other podcasts out there, and a whole lot more. If you ever thought about starting your own podcast, but you don't know where to begin, this is the show for you. I wish I would have known Mr. Ingalls and talked to him when I started my podcast 5 years ago. It would have made things a lot more simple for me. And now I give you Robert Ingalls. Hey, everybody, this is Brian Beckcom, and I have got Robert Ingalls on the show. Robert, as I said in the introduction, is an expert in podcasts, and he's got a great company and a great story about how he got started. Robert, how you doing today, man?
I am lovely, and we just got done talking before you hit record about maybe talking about some fun things, so I'm super pumped.
Me too. So it's, this morning I was thinking, this is kind of a meta podcast. So this is a podcast about podcasts. And, we were talking right before the show, Robert, you've got for people that are just listening and not watching this on YouTube, you have a beautiful studio. It looks incredible. I want to talk about gear today. I want to talk about microphones. I want to talk about software. I want to talk about production. I want to talk about philosophy, and I want to talk about why start a podcast. Like, why would we even start a podcast? What's the point? But before we do all that stuff, Robert, why don't you tell everybody a little bit about yourself? Give us your story. You got a great story.
Sure. I'll try to make it tight. I have a background as a lawyer. I practiced for almost 7 years, and I went to school to be a criminal defense attorney. That was just the path I wanted to be on. And I made it not quite 3 years, I think, in that field. It was a little heavy for me. It was I am the kind of person, for better or for worse, that likes to get along. I like it when everybody around me just kind of enjoys my presence and is happy to see me. And that's what brings me joy in my day-to-day life. And it wasn't like that at all. The victims are always angry at you. You're lucky on any given day if the judge, the prosecutor, and your client aren't also angry at you. And it became very heavy. The kind of topics and types of cases I was dealing with started to be things that were keeping me from sleeping at night. And then I was seriously dating a woman. We were talking about getting married, and I knew I didn't want to stay in that spot. And so I transitioned to doing some general civil, and that seemed okay for a little while, but it's high conflict, and that started to wear on me. Then we started family planning, and I just looked at my life I was thinking somebody might live here next year. And I knew what kind of father I wanted to be. Like, I knew that I wanted to be present, and I didn't want to miss things. And I looked at my life and I realized, like, that's going to be incompatible, the two things that I want. And one thing really though that struck me was I looked at the people I looked up to in the field, the ones in my local area, the successful people, and none of them had a life that I wanted.
Yeah.
That would make me happy. And that said a lot to me. And so that kind of sent me on a soul searching path of what am I going to do? I had no idea what that was going to be. But when we started seriously talking about family planning, I had a little bit of a freak out because I just was like, I can't do this. And I made a list. The top of that list was money. Got to get that together because I wasn't making enough money either. And that led me to a book about money. That author had a podcast. That was the first podcast I'd ever listened to. And that just took me down the rabbit hole. I think it was the very second podcast I listened to. Tom Bilyeu from Quest Nutrition was the guest on there. And if nobody's ever listened to him, like, this dude is hyper focused on mindset and becoming who you want to become, the world be damned.
Yeah.
Don't take no for an answer. And this is just an idea I'd never really encountered before. One of the reasons I went to law school and became a lawyer because it was a safe path. Uh, if that makes sense, it's not. It's well, well trodden. The if you follow the map, you will get there. You go to school, you take the test, you go to law school, you take that test, you become a lawyer. It was relatively safe, and so the idea that I would just run off into a field and do something else that nobody was really doing or had done before had never occurred to me. And in that moment, I'm listening to this, and I'm thinking for the first time in my life, I'm truly thinking, I think I can do anything I want. And that was kind of moment one on this journey. Within 30 days of listening to that podcast, I owned $1,000 worth of gear. I'm set up in my spare bedroom. This microphone was part of it. Go big or go home. And I'm set up in my spare bedroom and just playing with a mixer. That's back when we didn't have the Roadcasters and things that were really easy to record with. And so I'm learning how to use a mixer and a digital audio recorder, and I'm eating it up. I'm loving it. Now, I lasted in law a few more years because, who am I? What am I just going to start doing this for other people and make money? That was bananas to me. So I lasted in law a few more years, but eventually my passion for this started to shine out into the world, and people started asking me to help them. And that's where it started. It was just one lawyer just saying, hey, you think you could help me start a podcast? And from there, it just kept going. And I got a full-time job at a bank to pay the bills while I really tried to build this. And it worked. I got my first client about 6.5 years ago.
Beautiful. LawPods is the name of your business. And, I got to tell you, Robert, you said some things just now that I think really bear repeating because kind of like you, I don't have any lawyers in the family. I grew up with really no lawyer mentors in my family on either generation as far back as I can trace, which is like 8 or 9 generations. So I go to a good law school. I make really good grades. And I just did what everybody else did, which was go work at a big law firm. And I thought that's what you're supposed to do, billing 2,500 hours a year. I literally remember being told that my wife was pregnant with my first child and she was going to give birth any day. It was like we had a week window. And I was asked to fly out of town for a deposition in a case it was not even that big of a deposition. And I said, no. I don't want to do that. I want to be close to my wife in case she gives birth. And one of the partners looked at me and said, you're never going to make it in the law if that's your attitude. And I remember thinking, well, if that's what it takes, then I don't want to ever make it.
I don't want to play your game.
Yeah, I don't want to play that game. And the funny thing about it is now, the person that told me this, I could run circles around him in the courthouse. Plus, I have a pretty good life because I basically do whatever I want to do. But I didn't. Kind of like you, and it's not just in law, it's in any business, accounting, finance, any profession. There's kind of traditionally a way that you kind of work your way up the ladder. But I was fortunate when I started my own firm 20 years ago now, my firm's 20th anniversary, that I found a mentor. And this mentor taught me a couple very, very important things. His name is Ben Glass. The first thing he taught me was to always ask, who made that rule? Who made that rule?
I love it.
Like who said you had to work 7 days a week, 14 hours a day to be a good lawyer? Who made that rule? And so constantly questioning conventional wisdom became kind of part of my DNA. And the other thing that he did, Robert, which was mind-blowing to me, I think most people, particularly professionals, they have their work and then they design their life around their work. And he said, no, time out. He goes, design your life first. What do you want your life to look like? And then design your work around that. And that made a profound influence on me. And so to wrap this back all the way around to what we're talking about, starting a podcast, I don't care who you are. I don't care what you do, whether you're a professional, whether you're a blue collar worker or anything in between. You can start a podcast if you want to nowadays. And There's essentially no barriers to entry. So let's start with the very first question. That when I started my podcast during quarantine, and I had two questions: what would it be about, and why the hell would anybody listen to me? And
Those are good questions.
so those were fundamental to me. And so in my mind, if I were giving people advice about a podcast, the very first question I would ask them is, why are you doing it? Like, what do you want to accomplish? And so what do you think about that, Robert?
I think that there are too many podcasts out there that clearly did not stop and ask that question before they got started. And it feels like we're reading from the same playbook, because that is the first thing I ask people. Why are we doing it? Why are we doing it? Who are we doing it for? What does that person want to know? What's their pain point that is going to make them show up and return, and that I'm uniquely qualified to talk about? It is really it. It's like we need to do that analysis before we even know if we should. Because yeah, it's cool. Podcasts are cool. We're on it right now. We both think they're cool. But I learned very early that just having fun and doing the cool thing is not going to pay the bills. Like, you've got to figure out what the business model is. And the beautiful part about podcasting is it's growing every year. Just year over year, consumption is growing across every demographic, because it does what no other form of marketing can do. It sells you time.
Yeah.
It doesn't, or even entertainment. It doesn't ask you to stop what you're doing and watch or read. Do whatever you're doing. It'll come with you. And so that's why it's grown in popularity all over the place. But one of the reasons you see it excelling in business.
Well, and for me, so I was sitting there, it was in the middle of quarantine. I took it real serious, at least in Houston. It was pretty serious. Everybody's home all the time for months and months.
Yeah. How'd you even find a mic during that time? Like, they
That's
were
a great
so hard
question.
to get.
They were hard to get, and I did get a professional mic, and it was very difficult to do. I actually think I borrowed it, my first mic, from somebody. If you want to know the truth, I found somebody that had done radio before, and I think I borrowed a mic from them. But I remember sitting there during quarantine and watching mainly social media and just thinking, God dang, this is just all so negative. And where are the leaders? I know a bunch of people that are positive leaders. Why don't we hear from them? And I started thinking, that's my podcast. I'm going to start interviewing people that are positive people, that are good leaders, that maybe you don't hear quite as much about because they just go about their business day to day and they're not making a big stink out of everything. And then my wife, originally, and I think a lot of podcasts are like such and such with Robert Ingalls, such and such, Brian Beckham's podcast, blah, blah, blah. My wife said, why don't you call it Lessons from Leaders? And I go, boom, Lessons from Leaders. Great name, has alliteration. Plus, how do you think this pitch is? Hey, Robert, I have a leadership podcast. I would like you to come on. Instead of saying, I would like you to come on Brian Beckham's podcast, I have a leadership podcast. And so it is very, very easy, because of the focus of my podcast, to get guests to come on, quite frankly. But that's kind of the conceit or the notion behind my podcast and how I got started. So talk a little bit about when you're coaching people, when you're teaching professionals how to start podcasts, and you're asking, like, what is it about? What's it going to be called? What's the focus? Like, what you tell people.
Yeah, so if I was talking to a family law attorney, I would say, why are we doing it? Because there's a few big reasons that an attorney might consider doing it. The primary one I see, especially among practitioners like family law, personal injury, criminal, states, is FAQ. They are speaking directly to the questions that a prospect has to nurture that lead in the funnel. And so we know what they want to know. They ask it in every consult. And so, but then there's the other one that we see a lot, which is we're going to create something for our colleagues or our referral sources, people that will end up sending us business. And if we write a book, these are people that follow us that will buy that book. These are, fans that we're creating. And so why are we doing it? Establish that. And I really do my best, and I usually am successful at convincing them not to merge the two into one, because that is a frequently that's something that comes up is, well, can't I just do like one episode like this and one episode like this? Yes, you absolutely can. But I tell people to think about the podcast you listen to. Do they do that?
Yeah.
It's very rare that every episode of a successful podcast isn't for their avatar. They're usually thinking every episode should be for that avatar. Now, that doesn't mean certain episodes won't draw different people. Oh, I'm interested in this specific thing. But if you are educating personal injury attorneys about the finer points of trial work, and then they subscribe to that podcast, and every other episode you're talking about whether they should see a chiropractor, and they're like, wait, what? No, I know. Like, what? It's to them, it would be very strange. Like, why is he peppering in stuff for his clients when this podcast is intended for me to learn about how to be a better trial lawyer? And you're doing the same thing with any area. Now, if you're doing stuff for clients, I don't think clients are going to care as much, because clients aren't subscribing to your podcast if it's a FAQ model. They're showing up, they're getting the information they want, and they're probably hiring you and maybe never thinking about the podcast again. That's great, because it was a lead nurture. You nurtured the lead, they converted. Boom. We don't need them to subscribe to a podcast like that. And so you don't really need to worry what else is on the feed for them too much. But for the other, if you're making this other stuff on the feed, you're just confusing a listener. If you're trying to have subscribers, if any of those people should be subscribers, you're confusing people. Yeah. And I think it makes for a bad experience. And I tell people, if you want to do two things, make two podcasts. It's not that much more complicated to have a second. Like, once the pieces are in place to distribute a second podcast, there's a little heavy lifting in the beginning. But I would much prefer somebody do one thing than try to do two things poorly.
Yeah. And that's good advice in general for business. Like, you can have, let's say, for example, you're an accounting firm and you want to focus on professionals as opposed to small businesses. You can do both, but you should tailor your message to the different audiences, right? So, for example, in my firm, I do trial work, but I have a different message I represent a ton of people that work on boats and ships and stuff offshore. But then I also represent a bunch of people that have problems with their insurance company, and the messages are different for both. I'll tell you, one of the neat things as far as lead generation for me has been, you're right, most of my clients don't subscribe to my podcast, but who does subscribe to my podcast is the professionals that are sending me business. And so what I do, and we can talk about this in a little more detail, every time I'm finished with a podcast, it goes through a production thing, and I add some intros and outros, and then it's spread out on the different podcast platforms and YouTube and stuff like that. But then I chop it up. I'll have like little 3-minute segments and 5-minute segments, and those go out every single day. And it's like evergreen. And what I mean by evergreen is I can go back, and I've got a podcast from 3 years ago, How to Give a Great Speech, by somebody who's a great speaker. And all I have to do is you want to know how to go give a great speech? Go listen to this 5-minute clip from my guest, Lori Gilbertson, who is amazing. Or I had a U.S. Congressman, Will Hurd, who's a China expert. Every time I hear something about China, I'm like, go listen to what Will Hurd said about China. So you end up building this essentially database of content. And so it's not like and certain podcasts are different, but like particularly the type of stuff that you do, you create an inventory of marketing assets that you can say, oh, you have a question. Like if you're dealing with a trust lawyer, oh, you have a question on setting up a trust for your kid's college fund. I did a podcast about that 3 years ago. Here it is. Here's a short clip. So the point is, it's not just a one and done thing. Like if you treat it like an asset, that's what it becomes. Every single episode becomes like a little mini asset for you.
Absolutely. And that's a big part of what we do with clients is we do exactly what you just said. You've got that audio, you've got the full length video, you take that video, you clip it up into a bunch of different pieces, and you can clip it into short pieces for reels with captions and branding. And that allows people to have a very mostly frictionless interaction with your content and start to understand the value of it before they have to ever listen to an episode. Yeah. Because there's so much friction in that type of thing where you would say, even your friends will send you a podcast and be like, dude, I listened to this. Is so good. You should listen to it. You might one day listen to that podcast.
Yeah.
But there's so many. We already have so many that we've already subscribed to that we haven't listened to, ones that we really want to listen to that we haven't listened to yet. So there's a lot of friction there. And that's where these pieces of micro content shine. They allow people to interact with the content and go, oh, that is for me. I do like that. I like the personality. I like the content, whatever it is. And then they seek it out as opposed to, trying to get someone to take that big friction of like, press play on this. That's why I tell people, if all you're going to do is record the audio and put the iTunes link onto LinkedIn and say, listen, that is going to be a slow build of an audience. Yeah. It's not impossible, but the odds of someone clicking that link and going on that journey with you when they're just scrolling on LinkedIn are really low.
Yeah, no doubt. So let's get into some of the practical parts of podcasts. So you've got your podcast name picked out. You've got kind of the purpose of the podcast. Now you need a guest, right?
If that's the kind of show you're doing.
Yeah, some podcasts, I suppose, would just be one person or maybe, two people kind of talking about a subject or something. Most podcasts, I don't even want to say most podcasts, a lot of podcasts now involve,
probably most.
Yeah, having like inviting a guest on to talk about something. So let's assume for this discussion that you're going to have a podcast where you actually invite guests. How do you get your first guest?
Well, I'll say even today, it's a lot easier to get people on your podcast than you might think. And you're a podcast host, so you know that.
For sure.
People, it's especially in a more niche area, people are looking for avenues to promote themselves.
Yeah.
And I would even say if you have a podcast, finding guests is probably not going to be the annoying part. It's dealing with all the people that want to be a guest on your show that have no business being a guest on your show, wading through those emails. But when you first start, think about, let's go back to that avatar. Who it is, who are we doing it for, what do they want to know? Because we always want to serve that avatar with all of our content, and even with the guest. If you start bringing on guests that don't make sense and aren't offering value, then that is not, you're going to start to lose trust with the people who are listening to the show. But really reach out to people. Like if you know enough about the subject matter that you are the person who needs to be talking about it, I'm going to assume that you already have a network of some kind that would make sense to come on. And I see, even with my clients, frequently some of their first guests are people they already know.
Yeah.
Just to get going with it, bring it on. But even if you don't know the people, send an email. Here's what we're doing. But I will say the benefit of already having a couple episodes before you do too much cold outreach is you reach out to someone and you add a link. Hey, here is an episode I did with XYZ, maybe the most prominent person you've gotten so far. And then that gives them an opportunity to listen to it really quickly and see that you're real. Like it's a real show. It's got an intro to it that sounds good. It's edited in some capacity. It doesn't sound like there is a leaf blower in the same room. And it just tells them I'm a serious person.
Yeah.
And I should be taken seriously. And I'm going to treat you with that degree of seriousness. And I'm going to create a good product that you can be proud of. And I even tell them what's going to happen. Hey, here are some assets that we create from each episode. We're going to be creating them from your episode too. So they're going to have a full-length video of them sounding really smart and video clips and things like that. So letting them know those things. And then as you build with a guest here and there, let's say you want to do CFOs of multinational corporations, land a couple. Once you've got a couple, it's going to be really easy to get the rest because it's like, Susan from this other company was on. Here's her episode that she did with us. And right there, you've got that social proof of having someone else there. So that makes getting guests much easier. But I haven't seen a problem getting people onto the podcast too much.
You
I'm
know,
sure that by the niche it varies.
it's amazing you'd say that, Robert, because when I first started my podcast, I had a great guy that worked with me, Carlos. He helped me produce it. And I told him first, gosh, probably 7 or 8 guests I had were friends of mine. I mean, I happen to know a lot of people that are military colonels or generals or judges or things like that. So I have a pretty cool group of friends, but the first 7 or 8 were friends of mine. And I remember telling Carlos, I said, you know how we're going to tell that the podcast has made it is when people start asking us to come on the show. And what I didn't realize, Robert, was, and for everybody that's contemplating starting a podcast right now, I'm about to tell you something that Robert absolutely knows and that I absolutely know, but you may not know. There is an entire ecosystem of agents and people that facilitate getting guests on podcasts. So my problem is not having that guest right now. My problem is I get 25 emails a week from agents and other people trying to place me on podcast or trying to place different people on podcasts. And really, really the hard part, like you said, Robert, is not having enough people. It's like screening through like who really belongs on this podcast. Because what you'll find when you start your podcast, I think, Robert, tell me if you've seen this with the people you've worked with. They do a couple podcasts and all of a sudden people start wanting to come on. And you just want to say yes, 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 yes to everybody.
Sure.
And the next thing you know, you're shooting a podcast and like you're in the middle of the podcast going, man, what the hell? Why am I talking to this guy, right?
Right.
Or this girl? So if you're worried about getting guests, I would say that is probably the least of the worries because you will for sure start getting solicitations. I mean, like I said, I get so many every week. I kind of lose count. I just forward them to my production manager and ask, does this look like somebody that would be a good fit? But let's talk about, okay, so you got your guest, you got your name, you got the purpose.
Let me jump in real quick.
Yeah, sure.
Not to take over, but on this guest
please.
side, there is immense value when you're starting your podcast in thinking about the value of the guest, because bringing on a guest and having value for your audience is one thing, but the other side of that is building your network in 45-minute increments on the microphone with people that you don't know. That's one of the things that I have found incredibly valuable. My clients also found very, very valuable is you're reaching out to someone you don't already know. They come on, they get to know you. They could be a potential client. They could be somebody who could potentially in the future. Now you're not asking for that business. You're just getting to know them and establishing yourself and your bona fides. And you're at that point, at the end of that conversation, they're going to know you. They might like you. They might start to build some trust with you. And now they might be a referral source. They might be a client. At any rate, they're now in your network. And that is something to really consider.
And that is an awesome point. And what I do is after a podcast is released, I shoot an email to the guest. It's just been released. Here are all the different places I'm promoting it. Here's what we suggest you do. Here's a T-shirt from the podcast. And then I put them in my database of emails so to where they continue to get it. And so now I've got upwards of 100 people that like, I knew my first 7 or 8 guests, and I've known some of them since then, but most of them, the first time I meet them is when they come on the show. And it's incredible. Like the network I've been able to build. And again, the great thing about it is it's totally organic. Like I'm not seeking to build a network. It just happens when you have a 45-minute conversation with somebody about something that they like, you're going to bond with them a little bit. And so it is a phenomenal, just like you said, it is a phenomenal network building process. And the other thing that I have found that happens fairly frequently now, Robert, is I'll have somebody on my show, and at the end of the show, they'll say one of two things. They'll say, man, I got a couple people that would be perfect for your show. And I'll be like, boom, give me their names, give me their numbers. Sounds awesome. Or what they'll say, why don't you come on my show? I got a podcast, and why don't you come on my show? Because it would be great. I just shot a podcast on Tuesday. I was on a gentleman's podcast. It was a phenomenal show. And at the end of the deal, I said, man, I got to get you on my show. I mean, we had talked for an hour. We could have talked for 3 hours. I said, let's finish this. Why don't you come on my show? And so the networking, it goes in all different directions, and it's really awesome. But let's get down to the kind of the nitty gritty, because this is an area where I can offer a little bit of advice, but I need some help. And I know you're an absolute expert on this. So podcast is audio. The audio quality must be good. Like if you have poor audio quality, your podcast will fail. And so you got to have good audio quality. I think that is absolutely non-negotiable. Number one. And number two is, if you have video, you want the video to be as good as it can be. I don't think video is quite as important, because I think and you can tell me if I'm right about this or not, I would bet that the majority of podcasts are listened to and not watched. Now, a lot of podcasts are probably watched too, but I think you got to have great quality audio and you got to have good quality video. So talk about, and by the way, for people that are listening on YouTube or watching on YouTube, you can see this beautiful studio that Robert has built. And I want you to tell me like how you built it, because
I will.
I want to build something like that. But talk about audio quality, talk about video quality, talk about software. Like
Sure.
how do you get the podcast on the platforms? Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so you're totally right. I'm very much audio first. We're a podcast company. We're not a video company. We do video, but it starts with the audio. The very first thing is we engineer the audio, and then we make the audio edit.
Yeah.
And then that's where it starts. We send that to the client and say, how is this? And then once that is approved, then we take that engineered audio that we did from the initial engineering, we use that for the video, and then we use that audio as a go-by to cut the video separately. Yeah. And because I recommend cutting your audio and your video separately when it becomes practical. Yeah. Because in audio, I want to cut everything that is a distraction that doesn't add to the listening experience. Because when we're watching, like right now, we're looking at each other. I can see your body language. I can see the way that I might notice that you might start to look agitated at some point, and I can figure out what to do, whatever. When we're listening to somebody, we don't have any of those cues. So if somebody was watching us when we're talking to each other, we are going to have more leeway. But when we're cutting audio, we're going to cut it much tighter. We're going to cut way more filler words, but only if we can cut them without leaving a trace. We're going to trim out some silences unless they matter, unless they're like hanging silences of somebody thinking deeply about a question. Otherwise, we're going to tighten it up because we want that listening experience to be really good. If you make those same edits in a video, it's going to look ridiculous. It's going to be super jumpy and just a bad experience. So we're audio first. Absolutely. I think it should sound good. And honestly, there's no excuse for it not sounding good. Buy yourself an ATR 2100X. That might cost $40 or $50 right now. And you're going to sound virtually indistinguishable from the way I sound right now, as long as you're in a quiet room.
What kind of mic is that you've got right there? That's a gigantic looking professional mic. What do you got there?
This is the Heil PR40. Back when I started podcasting, it was like a lot, like all of the podcasters in that moment, the ones I was listening to that were teaching about podcasting, were all using this. Nice. And so that's what I bought, and I love it. I mean, it's stuck with me from, I bought this in 2015, and I don't see any need to not have it ever. I love this mic.
It sounds amazing. Yeah. And everybody that's listening to it can tell the difference, I'm sure, between Robert's mic and my mic. I've got a Shure, I think it's an M7.
Well, and if you want to, I mean, if you'll follow me along in real time, I can make your sound better right this second.
I absolutely want to do that. But
in
my point is,
my
point is that I have an expensive microphone.
Yeah, but if you bring it in a little tighter,
like that's what I was going to say.
Tighter to your face like that,
it sounds good, but it doesn't sound as good as yours. So here we go. I'm going to move it a little closer. Okay, there we go. I got it a little closer. I don't know what others say.
Oh my word, that
nice.
Is infinitely better.
That sounds better, and you sound literally like professionally produced. I mean, just absolutely perfect.
Yeah, you brought that mic in and now it's in the frame, but that's okay. But you've
Yeah.
got it nice and tight. And that mic has what is called a cardioid pickup pattern, which means it's picking up what's right in front of it.
Yeah.
And so when you listen to me, when I get back here, I don't
Yeah.
sound nearly as good. But
Good
when I get
point.
right up here, it's getting this, and it's not having to grab like my echoes off the wall the same way. And I turn it like this, you're not going to hear me as well. It's right here.
We literally
And
did
that
a
also
live
allows you to,
demonstration.
there you go. It also allows you to bring the gain on your microphone down a little bit. And so
Yeah.
it doesn't pick up background noise as much because you're closer to it and it's only, you're getting your voice. So there you go. Worth the price of
Amazing.
admission right
Amazing.
there.
We literally, we're both lawyers by training, and you're not really supposed to do live demonstrations unless you've tested them like 10 times. So we just kind of jumped out on the diving board there a little bit and it worked. But everybody, like, this is a perfect example of why having a professional like Robert is a good idea, because he knows his stuff backwards and forward. So, number one, have a good mic. Number two, put it the right distance from your mouth. And then the other thing I've noticed is, so some people have in-person podcasts. Let's set that aside a little bit and talk about podcasts where you do it kind of the way we're doing it, where you don't have to be physically in the same room. I use the camera, and I've got a couple external cameras that I can mount on top of my computer screen that look at me. The problem is the computer screen sends off light in the form of
Right.
LEDs and pixels and stuff. And I wear glasses, and that light reflects off my glasses, so it's hard to see my eyes. So, like, I'm taking off my glasses right now, and you can see my eyes. But when I put these on, it reflects. Whereas you have none of that. Like, you look like you're being filmed by Martin Scorsese, right? I mean, like, you look like perfectly. So talk about how you set this up, how you set up the visual appearance that you've got. Plus, by the way, you've also got like a real kind of like a cool purple lavender look in the back, and it's kind of nice and dark, and it's not distracting. I've got a blurred background, so people can't see my background. But talk about how you set
Yeah.
all this up.
Sure. So what I'll do is I'll tell you a little bit about it, and then if you're up for it, I'll actually switch over to the cam on my iPhone and I'll give you a quick look at it.
Would love that.
But so the lighting really is the thing. Like when you look and you say, "Oh, that just looks good," a lot of that is the lighting. Now the camera is important, and it's going to give it that 4K sharper look. But when you add the lighting to it, that's really going to do the thing. But I'll tell people, for the average person, for the average lawyer, I am going to say stay out of this. Like I know it looks cool to look like this, but for the average lawyer, for my clients, my average client, they want to sit down at their desk. They want to plug their USB microphone in. They want to have a conversation. They want to hang up, and they never want to think about it again. Great.
Yeah.
But some people want to do this. And so when it comes to the camera, I don't use a traditional webcam. I use, it's really a point and shoot Sony. It's the Sony ZV-1 M2. And I think it's about $800. And I use that and run it with an HDMI capture card. And that capture card goes right into my hub, or you could plug it right into your computer, but I just have a hub that runs everything. And you send the HDMI signal, like you're not recording on the camera, you're just sending the video feed from the camera into your computer to use as a webcam. And if you use that capture card, it'll let you send that 4K signal. And so that is what's the difference between this camera and a web camera is very stark.
Yeah.
And then I have 3 points of light here. I've got, a key light here just in front of me. And I got this one. They're not super expensive. I think they're about 150 each. And I've got one here and one over my shoulder, and they're Loom Cube is the brand, and they're studio lights, just studio lights from Loom Cube.
But how do you know how to set them up? Like, how do you know how to position
it takes some time.
Yeah.
It takes some time. I mean, I think lighting was the last thing to come for me.
Yeah.
Because it was complicated. It took me a lot of time to understand light, because you don't want natural light in here.
Yeah.
So you close off the windows because you want to be able to control the light. You don't want your overhead light because that is just, it's, I don't know all the correct terminology, but it's very aggressive light, and it's just very shadowy. It's coming from above you. And really, a 3 points of light setup, you can do this pretty cheaply just with stuff on Amazon right away. And I mean, it can also be tens of thousands of dollars if you want it to be.
Right.
But point of light here, a point of light to fill in the shadows here, and then I put one right over here. I put just a small one right over here, so I've just got a little bit of soft light right here as well. And then behind me, you can see those. I've got 2 lights behind me that are they're called tube lights, and I've got those mounted right, so you can't really see them because they're right behind my head right now. But one of them is a little bit orange pointing that way, one of them is a little bit bluish pointing that way, and that's what makes that effect on the wall behind me. And I am in the middle of learning how to put a lamp in the background that will also just add a little bit more to the shot, but little by little.
That's beautiful. And so I actually have a light here that I just turned on, and
Yeah.
just to give people, and this is not a studio light, this is just a lamp that I use for my desk, but just to kind of give people a different, for people that are watching on the video, you can see, like, depending on the angle, see, that's really harsh, I think. Like, that has, it's kind of
Yeah.
shining off my forehead and stuff. And if I just move it a little bit, now it's got a little better look to it. It's a little softer. If I turn this off completely, now all of a sudden it's got a little bit different look. And so the lighting, especially, well, only for podcasts that are going to use video, can also be important. But I'm with you, Robert. I don't think the video is nearly important for podcasts as the audio. The audio has to be top notch. So let me ask you this. So in terms of how you shoot so we've got our guests, we've got our show, I got our title, we got our purpose, we got our avatar audience, we've got our mic, we've got our lighting, we've got our video camera. How do we start how do we record the podcast? What software do we use?
Sure. I'm a big fan of Riverside. It allows you, there's Zoom. Zoom is an option. I like that one. The only downside to Zoom is you're going to end up with guests that have bad internet, and that's going to significantly detract from the quality of the audio and the video.
Yeah.
But the nice thing about Riverside, but there's also Squadcast, another good option, Zencaster. There's lots of.
I think Anchor does some stuff.
Do they have it now?
I think they do some podcast stuff. But the point is.
Oh yeah, absolutely. But as far as like recording it, those platforms are great because they are going to get high quality audio and high quality video on separate tracks, which I'll explain why that's important in a second. But the nice part is it's recording locally for every guest and then uploading in real time. So if somebody has bad internet or their internet even drops for a second, you don't lose anything. They come right back on, it finishes uploading, and even in real time, if it goes out a little and you miss a word, it's still in the final product because it's recording locally. So I love those platforms, and they give you good quality videos. So if you're getting, the way I look to myself right now, even if it's a little lower quality on your side, if we're recording on Squadcast or Riverside, it's going to look exactly like you see yourself, which is super nice.
Yeah, that's super cool. And I've been on some shows that use Riverside, and I found it pretty helpful. The other thing I think about Riverside is if you use Zoom, which I use, then the file has to process afterwards, and I've got to upload it, and that takes some time. I think Riverside kind of does that all simultaneously.
It's pretty intuitive as well to use. So when you're bringing guests on, it tends to be relatively easy for them to use. There's only a couple browsers that are supported for it, so that can be a little bit annoying sometimes.
Yeah, that annoys me. Firefox and Chrome. I use Safari. And gosh, dang, I got to pull Chrome up every time I use Riverside.
Yeah, Chrome, Microsoft Edge.
Yeah. Other than that, it's great. So how do you? Just using my podcast as an example, I put it on YouTube, which is one process. But then I also put it on Google Play, Apple Podcasts, Overcast, Spotify.
So where are you hosted?
So that's the question that I was going to ask. How, if you're telling people, like, how do you get your podcast on, YouTube's fairly straightforward, but how do you get it on all the different podcasting catchers?
Yeah. So you want a hosting platform where essentially you're going to go to this place, you're going to add all the information about your show, you're going to put your cover art there, all the details. And then every time you release an episode, that episode is going to get added to the feed. That feed is just a piece of code that you go to Apple. When you first launch your show, you go to Apple, you submit that link. You go to Spotify, you submit the link, Amazon Music, Audible, any Pocket Cast, everywhere that you want podcasts to go, you submit that link. And then once it's accepted there, now your show is on the platform. And so that show is connected to your hosting platform. So now when you publish an episode, within minutes, usually that episode is going to be live on all those platforms because all of those platforms are checking the same feed, your RSS feed. And when something new shows up there, they all see it and they go, ooh, new show. So you're not stuck trying to go to every platform and submitting an episode for all these. All you have to do is have a hosting platform that keeps it all in one place. And there's a handful, I mean, there's a lot of good ones out there. I like Captivate. They're one of the newer ones in the last 5 years, but they are very dependable. They're constantly coming out with new features. All of our client shows are on there. We love it. But there's tons of different ones. There's Anchor well, it's not even Anchor anymore. It's Spotify for podcasters.
That's right.
Spotify acquired Anchor and it's free. Now, I think that I would never put my shows on there because, I mean, when it's free, who's the product, right?
You are.
and that's part of it. But also, this is me personally. I love the podcast space because no one owns it.
Yeah.
Because look at YouTube as the perfect example. That's what Spotify wants. Spotify wants to be the YouTube of podcasts, and I don't want them to be. And because with YouTube, if you run afoul of what YouTube thinks or what is politically savvy for YouTube to decide in any given moment, you've essentially lost your entire audience. And there's one decision maker. Whereas with podcasts, I mean, even if Apple, the biggest one, 50, 60% of listens are coming from there routinely. Even if you lose Apple, they're just one. I mean, it's big, but you haven't lost your entire audience. Anybody that listens to podcasts can easily grab another player on any device that they're on and listen to your show within a couple of minutes. It's that easy. Yeah. And so that's one of the things I don't necessarily love about Spotify for podcasters is they are definitely angling for that. And I want to keep it as open as we can. But it really isn't difficult to get them up there.
It's interesting you'd say that because I agree with you philosophically 100% on what you just said. So I upload to YouTube, and that's a completely independent process. I have a hosting platform called Libsyn,
sure,
which I like. But there's
that was my first one.
We're talking about. There's plenty of podcasting platforms, and a lot of them do a tremendous job. So you have a lot of different options. But I actually upload to Spotify separately, and I use Libsyn to upload to the other kind of, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Overcast, Zencast, or some of the other ones. And I separate Spotify. And I'll tell you, kind of changing topics here a little bit. I made a very conscious decision when I started my podcast that I was not going to look at the statistics. Like I did not care about the statistics, at least initially. Like I don't care how many people listen, how many hours, none of that stuff. I was kind of doing it for myself. Now I started taking peeks and I was, whoa, that's pretty damn good. Wow. That's real. Oh my gosh. I can't believe I got that many listens on that one. But one thing I've found, and I'd like your advice on this because I'm sure people are going to be starting podcasts when they listen to this show and they're going to want to know how it's doing. And what I found is people ask me, how many listens do you get per show? And I say, that is actually really kind of hard to figure out because YouTube has a set of analytics. Spotify has a set of analytics. They all have different analytics. And then when you promote it, for example, so I'll promote shows on Facebook, put a little bit of money behind to add to the promotion. I mean, I'll get hundreds of thousands of quote impressions, but who the hell knows what that means, right? And so it's a little hard to kind of figure out because podcasts are spread out. Like, so what do you tell people when they say, well, am I going to get 10,000 listeners within a month, or how am I going to know how many people are listening to my show? What do you
Yeah.
tell them about that?
Well, and usually they'll say, well, how many listeners is good? And I give them the lawyer answer. It depends, because it really absolutely does. How big is the potential size of your market? And how many people are potential listeners? Because if you have this niche show, it's not gonna be everybody. And if you're doing a show that is intended to nurture leads, then yeah, we want people listening, but listeners we're measuring that a lot like we are website visitors. We shouldn't be thinking about what other podcasts are getting. We shouldn't be measuring ourselves against another podcast, because if you look, Joe Rogan is probably today still the biggest podcaster in the world, but his audience, almost anybody, is a potential listener for a podcast like that, because it's entertainment mainly. And so almost anybody is going to be willing to listen to that. If you're doing something more niche, even leadership, that is a much smaller audience, because not nearly as many people are interested in leadership as people are that just want to casually be entertained and laugh at things. And so when we're making a podcast, that's the first thing I want to think about, is like, think about who our audience is, what we're doing it for, and that before we ever think about metrics. And then when we're thinking about metrics, your hosting platform will give you pretty decent metrics, right? And then I mentioned a leaf blower earlier, and of course somebody has a leaf blower outside right now. It never fails. That's one thing I'll tell you. If you start a podcast, everyone you know around you will have a leaf blower immediately.
For sure. And by the way, I think gas powered leaf blowers should be banned. They should use electric ones. They make no noise. They're constantly going off all day long in my neighborhood. I'll tell you though, in terms of listeners. So how old are you, Robert? I'm 51, and
I am 43.
Okay, so you might get this joke and you might not, but Joe Rogan he reminds me of that dude in high school. He had graduated, he was a couple years out, kind of like the guy in Dazed and Confused. He always had access to cheap weed. He was a super fun guy. All right. And everybody liked him, but he was just kind of a bum a little bit. And so Joe Rogan is like that on steroids. But, in terms of listeners, like, I actually, for instance, for my podcast, I don't want to have tens of thousands of listeners. I want to have the decision makers. I want to have the leaders.
Who's listening?
Who's listening? Yeah, there's a great article, and I would encourage everybody to listen. And I'm the same way with my social media, by the way. I'd rather have 1,000 true followers than 10,000 fake followers. And there's a great article by a guy named Kevin Kelly. It's called 1,000 True Fans. And that's basically the point of the article. You want 1,000 people that really love what you're doing, not 10,000 people that are ambivalent about what you're doing. And so I think this, especially nowadays, there's kind of this clout chasing or chasing clicks and chasing views. That's the wrong metric. I mean, unless you're trying to be Joe Rogan, then that's the wrong metric. If you're just trying to start a podcast that has a particular niche, like you said, a particular audience, then who cares if people that aren't in that audience and aren't in that niche listen to it? That just doesn't matter, right?
Yeah, and the Rogan model is really, really difficult, because that's a volume model, and monetizing a volume model takes a lot of volume, and that's really hard, especially when you're starting out. And most people are using podcasts to sell a product, or market or an existing service, and just straight trying to be like, I'm just going to get so many listeners, and then I'm going to be able to sell ads on my podcast. That's great, but that can be a little bit more difficult. Now, one angle where you can do a little bit better with ads, I'm not saying you're going to necessarily make a lot of money on day one, but is if you have a hyper-focused niche where where an advertiser can, with a reasonable degree of certainty, believe that every single listener is a potential buyer. I am a sponsor. I sponsor a bunch of podcasts. That's a big part of my marketing. And I sponsor podcasts where the listeners are lawyers, all of them.
Yeah.
And that's highly targeted for me. So that's a much more valuable relationship because I know that anybody listening to a podcast already understands the medium and believes in it. They're going to be an easier sell. And I want to get in their ear and their potential clients. So that is a model that can work as well. But it's difficult. I think it's much more important if you're supporting an existing business, you need to think about, let's go back to those things that we talked about in the beginning. Why are we doing it? Who are we doing it for? How's it turn into money? And think about the podcast that way instead of thinking that we need to use the podcast in some way other people are using it. No, use it in the way it can best support your business.
There you go. Perfect. Love it. Well, Robert, I've kept you a little bit longer than we budgeted. I told you 45
Hey, man,
minutes.
you want to chat with Gear about me? I am on your schedule.
Well, I know how busy you are, and I know what you got going. Before I let you go, though, I want you to tell people a little bit about what you do for primarily lawyers who want to start podcasts. Like if I've got a bunch of lawyers that listen to this show, and if one of them's listening to it right now, I want them to know exactly what they need to do if they want your help. So what do they need to do if they want your help?
Shoot me an email at robert@lawpods.com. You can also put time right on my calendar if you go to lawpods.com. I always like to give a shout out to one of my favorite lawyers out of Charlotte, North Carolina, Harrison Lord.
Nice.
Not only does he have amazing hair, but he also
what a great lawyer name too.
Such a
Harrison
good lawyer
Lord.
name.
Are you kidding?
Harrison Lord. Yes, he's so cute.
And does he wear the what do they call them, the seersucker suits and drink mint juleps?
Not really. He may drink mint juleps. I bet he does. But he's not like a foghorn leghorn type of lawyer. Like deep south. But he was super supportive of my ambitions to go in this direction when I was practicing law, and he is the person that first said LawPods out loud, and I was like, that's really good because he was helping me pitch names and stuff. And so I thought about that really early. If you type LawPods anywhere, you can find us. I was very intentional about that. I got the .com a lot cheaper than I thought I was going to be able to get it because I guess they didn't have any other buyers, and I just kept giving them lower and lower numbers. Nice. But yeah, you can just put time on my calendar. I'm happy to have a chat. The first part of that chat's always the strategy. I know it's exciting. I know somebody told you should have one. But why? Why are we doing it? Because if we just do it because it's fun and we're not really thinking about that end goal of where we want to go, it's going to putter out eventually. And it's just not a good use of marketing dollars if we don't understand what success is.
And so if somebody, like in my view, having done this for a while now, I wish I would have had somebody like you right when I started that I could have called before I started.
Yeah, me too.
I kind of had to try. I had to kind of trial and error it. But when we're done with this podcast, I'm just telling everybody that's listening, I'm reaching out to Robert because there's some things that he can help me with my podcast right now. So I guess what I'm saying is, ideally, if somebody's thinking about starting a podcast, they would want to reach out to you before they even get started. So you can kind of get them started down the right path. But if they've already got one, you can still help them, I think.
Oh, absolutely. We take over podcasts all the time. I mean, one of the, I'd say probably one of the most downloaded podcasts in the trial lawyer space is Trial Lawyer Nation.
Yeah, I've been on their show. I've been on their show.
Nice.
They're amazing. I love their show. Yeah, I've been a guest on their show. They're awesome.
Well, go to episode 114. We'll go to episode 113 and then listen to 114, and you will hear the LawPods difference. And that's not to say anything bad about Michael and his team. It really isn't. We are podcast professionals. That's all we do. And we came on board and took over that show and made a noticeable difference right out of the gate. But that's why they hired us. And so that's just to say that we do that a lot. And I think it's great. If somebody wants to try it out on their own, go for it. Because at the end of the day, like we're not the cheapest game in town. Like we're very professional about what we do. We're really good at what we do, and we're gonna take it all off your plate for you. But if you want to spitball with it and you've got a little bit more time than you have money, do it. There's a lot of resources out there to help you kind of get started on your own. But we do take over podcasts all the time. But I would say any lawyer considering doing it themselves, I mean, I've been that lawyer. So be careful. because
Yeah.
you might end up out doing something like this, like me, because that's how it started for me. But it's also, you know this really well. Doing it right is a lot of work.
Yeah.
And I think about this in my own business. I know exactly what I charge per hour. Now I don't charge per hour, but I have a dollar amount. I had a coach
Yeah.
that made me come up with a dollar amount.
Yeah.
Anything that I can pay somebody less than that dollar amount to do, I
Isn't
pay
worth it.
them.
Yeah.
And that's the way I look at marketing, and that's the way I think that every business owner should look at their business.
It's amazing you'd say that, because I have a mentor too that said you should basically decide how much money you want to make every year, how many hours you want to make, or how many hours you want to work. Divide those numbers. That's the value of your time, and
Yeah.
anything you can do to buy that's less than the value of your time, you should do it. And let me just tell you something. And obviously, you're my guest here, but I really mean this. If you're thinking about starting a podcast, especially if you're a lawyer, I would recommend you call Robert first. It just makes the whole process easier. You might have to spend a little bit of money up front, but you'll get that back in quality and time, and you'll get that back 10 times over. So, like I said, I wish I would have had somebody like Robert to lean on when I first started my podcast. It would have made the whole thing a lot easier, a lot smoother, and I would probably have about 5 times as many listeners as I have now. So, well, Robert, thanks for coming on. This was a great conversation. And like we were talking about beforehand, I get a lot of people call me up. Hey, what equipment do you use? How do you record that? Blah blah blah. You know what I'm going to do now? I'm going to say go listen to my episode with the guy that started LawPods, Robert Ingalls.
Yeah, I
Appreciate you
love it.
coming
I
on the
mean,
show, man. Appreciate
I
it.
appreciate it.